Thank you and welcome Dr. Singh and Dr. Khayambashi for this wonderful presentation you've done on our behalf. And this fourth of the fourth of the four segments of this workshop you've put on for us. We're really looking forward to this Q&A session today, and we've got a bunch of questions already lined up. And
awesome.
and I even took the quiz, and I'm curious. Some things were pretty obvious to me, but I was curious if anyone else took the quiz, and we'll get going. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, I'm Diane Boca, and I'm the founder of Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation. And basically, we are working towards providing our youths with life coping skills while we try to build mindful and compassionate communities. And we do that by delivering webinars to the community and providing support for those impacted by emotion dysregulation and also their loved ones. So before we get started, just to familiarize you, if you haven't had a look at our website and with the program, Dr. Singh is a sociologist and social psychologist who specializes in how our emotions are connected to our psychological well-being. Her research primarily examines how emotions are used at our place of work. You can learn more about her and her valuable work at McMaster.ca. And her colleague today joining her, Dr. Khayambashi, is a seasonal professor at York University. She is a qualitative researcher who specializes in identity development of minority group identity. She has extensive knowledge of social psychology and completed several research projects exploring the environmental and social factors on self-development. So I thank you both for putting this on for us and on behalf of our audience.
Thank you.
All righty, so we'll get started. Just so that you know, the session is being recorded. I just want to disclose that to everyone. You're not, and if the audience, you're not being video recorded, so you can feel safe to select the all panelists and attendees button at the bottom of your screen and participate with any questions you may have as we proceed.
Great, thank you so much, Diane. I really appreciate that introduction. If it's okay, we would like to share our slides that we prepared. We're going to do kind of a bit of a review. And so we'll get into some discussion questions that we have, but then also we'll discuss, address any questions that there are that you guys may have. So hi everyone, welcome and happy Sunday. So this is, as Diane mentioned, the Q&A component for the workshop dealing with emotions at work. So as you know, I'm Dr. Singh and my colleague Dr. Khayambashi is here as well. And so we're going to be leading you through a kind of revisions of topics that we've discussed over the past 3 sessions. And then we're going to be, posting some questions and also opening up the floor for some discussion. So, please feel free to also use the chat function if you're not comfortable with speaking, which is totally fine. And Shirin and I will be kind of monitoring that. And we're going to try our best, to get everyone's questions answered. So with that being said, I'm really looking forward to it. We are very grateful for being invited to do this workshop, and we are excited to be here. So I just wanted to extend to Dr. Khayambashi. Did you want to say a few words before we begin?
You actually did a fantastic job at introducing it. And I'm really grateful that I have this opportunity to be part of this amazing experience. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and hoping to answer them in the best of my abilities. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. You can carry it on from here.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for that. So in this workshop series on emotions at work, right? So myself and Dr. Khayambashi have been discussing the broader kind of concept of emotional labor and work stress with you all. And so for some of you, you may not have been familiar with emotional labor, or maybe hadn't heard the concept before. And for some of you that may have heard of it, perhaps you encountered it in news articles or blog posts, which happen to be, the most common situation. And so part of the reason why we wanted to really kind of take this opportunity to share this knowledge is because a lot of what is discussed about emotional labor can sometimes be inaccurate or adapted to circumstances that don't truly capture the true essence of this, and can sometimes make it confusing for people to understand. So, that being said, in the first workshop, we started by kind of introducing you to the concept, as well as some perspectives on how it's defined, how it has been studied in research over the past few decades, and what we know about the different aspects of this type of work activity. And so by nature of the concept itself, we were primarily talking about the area of our lives that have to do with work, right? So in this case, that is interactive service work, and kind of taking a unique approach to understanding how emotions are embedded within these types of occupations, which we then think of service work, we're kind of talking about a broad range of occupations, right? So that can range from, customer service experiences, such as a grocery store clerk or a pharmacist, and then extending that out to occupations in care work. So like nurses, doctors, or, mental health and addiction staff, for example. The list is quite long. And so the commonality, though, with public facing work is that they all require some degree of emotion management and regulation. And so we then kind of moved on in the workshop series to kind of focusing on, well, what is emotional labor and what isn't, to really kind of ground our understanding of this concept. And so now when we think about emotions at work, and the easiest example that is relatable to most people is in and around, the saying, which I'm sure you've heard at some point, whether you work in service yourself or a customer at some point hearing this, is that idea of service with a smile, right? So this is that typical and most common idea of ideal customer service or client experience. And so we talked about how this requirement or expectation of service workers requires something more and a bit more invisible than just giving, that time, skill, and sort of reliability to a job, right? Many workers also have to give their emotions, because emotional labor is a requirement that transforms these kinds of feelings and emotions into a commodity that can be bought and sold, right? So then we kind of moved our conversation into exploring, well, where do these ideas and expectations about emotions come from? What makes the purchase of a product and the purchase of an experience wrapped up into one sort of big box with a shiny bow? And so here I briefly kind of moved into then this kind of social theory of emotions. And so in order to do this, what we did is we visited the field of sociology and talked about the sociologists who originally coined these concepts and ideas that we're talking about with regards to emotions at work. So as social beings, we have these, unwritten, sometimes written, but mostly informal social norms about emotions, or conventions about feeling. So these are essentially what we as sociologists call social rules. And so in her publication in 1979, the sociologist that we reference quite a bit in the workshop, Arlie Hochschild, she first began that conversation about the need to manage our emotions in order to feel and display the correct emotions that are appropriate to the situation. And so Hochschild kind of starts this conversation by first asking, why are emotions and our experiences of emotions as adults in daily life, why are they so orderly? How does everybody know what to do, and how do they know what to expect, right? So for example, why do people feel and express joy at parties, at birthday parties or weddings? Why is there social rules and conventions around gift giving and emotional expressions and customs and rules about these things? Every culture has its own variation. But there are these norms or expectations around emotional expression throughout these experiences. And so a more kind of formal definition is that, these are the rules that kind of govern how we try to feel or not feel that are appropriate to a specific situation. And so once we, really kind of grounded our understanding in this in the first workshop, we then kind of moved on to expand more on these notions. So we use the everyday kind of example of how emotions are embedded into conversation, right? So we're often talking about feeling. So as a refresher from, the workshops, they were 3 weeks back now. Let's say, you get into an argument with a romantic partner and you're explaining the fight to your best friend or a family member, for example. Some of you might say, well, I had the right to be angry with this person because so-and-so is happened. And I felt that this emotional reaction was warranted. So we speak about it in the sense of, being something you have a right to. Or, perhaps this is an instance where you open up to a friend or whoever it may be about, feeling guilty about something, whatever it may be. And the response is that, from your friend, you shouldn't feel guilty because, X and X and X is the explanation. But the point is that there is a set amount of, there's a set kind of rules about how it is that we should, they're sort of unwritten rules about how it is that we should feel and what we should express. And so the main example that we used throughout the workshop was this idea of what happens during gift exchange and, how the rules around giving and receiving are very much an emotionally kind of tangled process. And then all of this discussion led us to defining and understanding our main concept, which is emotional labor. So as a refresher, emotional labor was first coined by that same sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, in 1983. So she published a book entitled The Managed Heart, right, where she conducted some field research on flight attendants and bill collectors. And so what Hochschild documented was that flight attendants were expected to be nicer than what's natural. So they're expected to make people feel at home on a plane, feel safe, feel protected, just smile and smile and smile all the time when they do, their safety instructions and routine and nobody's listening and they're still, smiling all the time. This kind of means that, they needed to manage their emotions, right, internally in terms of what they were feeling in order to display this overly friendliness. That's kind of what they say is nicer than natural. It's not natural to be that friendly, right? And care about their job requirements and what their job required them to kind of display to passengers on the plane, right? So the display rules of their job required them to kind of internally manage their emotions in order to perform their work role. And this is what is called emotional labor, right? So it is that requirement of your job to manage your emotions effectively in an exchange for a wage. So going back to this idea of feeling rules at work, right? We used the example of the Starbucks barista in order to demonstrate this. And so when we think about, that idea that I was speaking about on the previous review slide, service with a smile and, what type of burden that might entail for someone when they're expected to do this for 8 hours over an extended period of time, we can, easily come to feel emotionally exhausted or burnt out, especially in the case where we might be dealing with someone who is not being very pleasant or, maybe having a bad day and taking it out on you. So this is where the notion of that barista's burden sort of comes from. And so we provided you with this article, this MSNBC article that was published back in 2013. And so the author published, and there's 2 articles that we provided, but they kind of speak to the similar sort of issue of emotional burden. And so the author published a story about emotional demands in toll on the barista. And we did ask you to read it. So I'm just going to say, just as a reminder. So the quote reads, "A Starbucks barista's job is more than just serving coffee. She also needs to be polite, even friendly to the customer. If she does her job correctly, then maybe the customer will walk away feeling like the barista was happy to serve him, that it was not just her job, but a genuine pleasure. In many jobs, that sort of projected enthusiasm may just be a way of earning some additional tips." So as I mentioned, we're slightly mindful of time. So we want to get into, the second half of this kind of review to get some discussion going. And so, we moved from this sort of idea of learning about the general concept of emotional labor to then kind of thinking about, what is this process, right? So it's not just this concept that exists. There's an intrapsychic sort of process that happens in order to be in a position where you are, performing emotional labor. And so, emotional labor has been considered by many work stress and health scholars, like myself and Dr. Khayambashi, as, problematic. And so there's a number of reasons why that can be the case. And so as a refresher, here is the conceptual model we use that explains this process, or how or why it's been considered problematic. And so if we understand emotional labor conceptually as a model, we can identify how this may result in negative health outcomes. And capturing this process is one of the focuses of some of my current research, in research that I'm collaborating with Dr. Khayambashi on right now with the Canadian Mental Health Association. And I share this because they're, oftentimes these kinds of things are misrepresented conversations about emotional labor and how it has been defined. So I would like to take the moment to kind of reiterate this process so we fully understand. So over here on this, in the conceptual model, we see on the left panel or box on the left side of the screen. I just wanted to check it was on the slide. We see this objective requirement of emotional labor, right? And so this includes what's referred to as display rules. So they're essentially those rules and expectations around, service delivery if you're in retail, or client care delivery or client care practices if you are in caring occupations. And so this is the expectation that we spoke about in the first half of the sessions for this workshop. And so in order to fulfill then these sort of professional expectations or display rules, individuals need to engage in a process of emotion regulation. And so there are two strategies that are a part of that. And so the first is surface acting and the second is deep acting. And so in terms of surface acting, this is one strategy, and it sort of includes a process of faking and sort of suppressing emotions. And so this is problematic for a number of reasons, right? So when you're constantly faking and suppressing your emotions, you can end up being in a state of what we call inauthenticity or dissonance, where you've now estranged yourself so far from what you genuinely feel and what you display that you're kind of alienated from your true self and what you're truly displaying and feeling, that there's a disconnection. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, review slide. But then the other strategy is what we call deep acting. So this is where the individual is actively transforming their internal feelings in order to kind of genuinely express themselves. And so this has been shown across many studies to be a healthier skill and strategy to use. So surface acting, if you recall, is, that video that I had shared with you, Lily Singh, she had created this YouTube video where she kind of demonstrated that whole process of faking her emotions. That is a really great example of surface acting. And so when we're suppressing emotions that we feel and we are surface acting, it can lead to problematic health outcomes. And so this is what we're going to talk about on this next slide, which is here. So this is where we take the conversation a step further, right? So, and answer this question. So why is emotional labor problematic exactly, right? So we now understand the process, the intrapsychic kind of process that occurs. So you have the option of engaging, which most people do, in either surface acting or deep acting, or there's the option of genuine expression where you engage in neither. But why is emotional labor potentially problematic? So what makes this a potentially negative experience for workers is it has to do with that concept that I spoke about, emotional dissonance. So this is that phenomena where the individual is internally and psychologically alienated from their emotions. It tends to happen after extended periods of exposure to faking or suppressing your felt emotions, which then leads to this state of inauthenticity and an alienation from oneself. But we also know that this is not just black and white. There is quite a bit of nuances and dimensions of these sort of findings to discuss and consider. We know that there's conflicting evidence that supports this hypothesis that emotional labor is bad, right? So some research finds that there are negative health outcomes such as elevated stress, decreased job satisfaction, burnout, emotional exhaustion, psychological distress, perhaps panic attacks. But on the other side of that is, this conflicting sort of evidence that emotional labor is not consistently producing poor health. So we find that there are obviously individuals who enjoy interacting and helping others as part of their job. It can be extremely rewarding, which we know, right? And it can lead to increased job satisfaction and the ability to, navigate surface acting or deep acting are not straining or problematic to an individual. And so, we get to this kind of point where we also then take this a step further to say, okay, so if we have conflicting evidence, then how do we explain that? How do we explain that there's not consistently this outcome of poor health? Well, we know that there are other factors involved. So we know that there's a number of workplace kind of context resources that are salient in kind of buffering emotional strain, meaning protecting the individual from experiencing emotional strain, because it intervenes in that process between exposure to emotional labor, experiencing dissonance, and having these poor health outcomes. And so building having these workplace contextual resources helps to support building the skills to successfully engage in healthier emotion regulation strategies. So in particular, these are, job autonomy and social support. So these are two psychosocial resources, that's what we call them, that reduce the depleting effect of emotional labor on your health. So particularly for emotional labor intensive work like healthcare and other, community care contexts. So, and I'll ask Dr. Khayambashi to maybe elaborate on some of the things that the preliminary sort of interviews that we're having and we're finding with frontline care workers right now during COVID-19. And so, we know from previous research that building toolkits that help build skills around effectively managing emotions and practicing self-care, like mindfulness and techniques like deep acting can really help protect workers in emotional labor intensive work from experiencing these negative health outcomes and, promote personal and emotional resiliency.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of, get into the last part of this sort of review and discussion. So in the third and last workshop, we focused on, what can we learn from previous research and sort of empirical findings on emotional labor and its consequences. Well, there are parts of this kind of area where they're solution focused, right? So knowing what we know, we can then ask ourselves, what are some skills and strategies? Because oftentimes it's like, okay, great, we've identified the problem. What are we going to do about it? So, what are some skills and strategies that can help navigate emotional labor demands at work? And now this is not by any means a, full sort of comprehensive list of strategies that this is clearly an evolving sort of field where like we're still trying to figure out what are best practices, but we can borrow from what we know and what has been previously said about the topic to kind of inform some things that we can do moving forward. And so part of that discussion was around what are some strategies that we can employ in order to help us build greater skills in things like emotional intelligence, which has shown, ultimately kind of helps aid us in deep acting. And so, one of the suggestions is to engage in a process of self-awareness and being sort of mindful, right? So this would involve kind of observing yourself and understanding your emotions and how you react. How do you react to people, particularly in problematic situations, and kind of reflecting and looking honestly about your reactions and assessing, whether you're open and accepting to the perspectives of others. And, the next is to kind of examine how you are reacting more closely in stressful situations, because it is oftentimes exposure to the negative sort of emotional experiences that lead to things like psychological distress or things like emotional exhaustion. It's of course not the pleasant experiences that we have. It's always the ones that are depleting to us, that act as stressors. And so the other part is then to examine our stress response. So what is your stress response, and how might that affect you negatively in terms of your own health and well-being? And there are a number of reflection tools around this. Part of that is the planner series that was released prior to this workshop that kind of talked about how do you call out and recognize your stress responses and understand them. So engaging in these kind of self-reflective tools are really important for becoming more aware and examining these patterns, even through journaling or a daily log. And so I then asked for everyone to take a moment to take this emotional intelligence quiz, and is by no means like saying that you're not emotionally intelligent if you don't score at a certain point on the in the tool, but just kind of one of those like tools to help us with self-reflection and kind of understanding, okay, well, we're taking this emotional intelligence quiz. Maybe perhaps prior to that you didn't know what encompassed emotional intelligence, and taking some time to look at the questions and ponder them and produce answers to them. That is also part of that self-reflection. So it's not so much about getting too caught up in the score that you got, but more of like understanding what is involved with emotional intelligence and recognizing what are the different dimensions or elements of that. And so we can, talk about that in the next set of questions. But I am going to turn this over now to Dr. Khayambashi to give a bit of a review of also what was covered in this last workshop series.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. And this is going to be my bet. It's not going to be that long. I'm going to let you guys leave as early as possible. So we kind of learned that it's important to be emotionally aware of our surrounding. But one of the ways to control that emotional stressors would be through effective communication. And I believe that effective communication becomes very important, especially in a workplace. So as a part of effective communication, it's good to have a solid peer support within your organization. If there's a problem, it's always good to kind of turn to your colleague, to your coworker, to the person who's more familiar with the stresses of the workplace, and just have a chat with them. The chat is not supposed to be to kind of solve the problem and bring a new fix to this issue. It's more like kind of a steam off, because sometimes we're unaware of the fact that it's not that the problem is huge. It's just a matter that we are not emotionally connected to the issue. So when you talk about it, you steam off a little and you realize, well, maybe I had a bad day. Maybe the problem was smaller than I evaluated it. So kind of having a chat with your coworker, it's not only about steaming off, but it's also going to give you a chance to evaluate the problem, to see if the problem is something that needs mentioning and opening up, maybe even having a chat with your supervisor. Clearly, another part of it is that you really need to know your job description. which kind of goes hand in hand with that effective communication. Because sometimes, because of the lack of that knowledge, you might start taking tasks that are not related to what you're doing more than what you're supposed to do. And before you know it, you're putting so much time on the things that are not related to your work and not getting your own job done. And that really causes a lot of stress for people, a lot of stress at the workplace. And if you have a full knowledge of your job description, you can simply look at it and say, well, what you're asking me is not on this list. And what you're asking me, it allows for the communication to begin. Because part of the effective communication is to open up the communication. A lot of times we don't open up the communication. And when we're avoiding that lack of communication, it leads to chronic stressors. And it's important to kind of have this communication very confidently and clearly. I'm going to talk about the 8 tips on communication techniques in just a little bit, but it's very important to kind of be very confident about what you want to say, because if you're not confident, it's going to lead into like kind of, I'm not sure and I'm just nagging. But if you're confident and you know what you want to say, it's going to help to create a healthier work environment. A lot of times we're avoiding conflict because we're afraid of leading to a toxic relationship with your coworker, leading to a toxic work environment. But if we have an open communication with everyone, if we are free to kind of express ourselves freely and discussing the problems in the workplace, we're going to have a healthier work environment, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. Regarding the issue of bullying and uh, any kind of bullying, whether it's sexism or racism, these are two of the most important issues. And I loved it that the question came up in the Q&A section a little earlier. But these two things, while I have a full understanding that racism and sexism are institutional problems, they are something that are so in tune with our day-to-day experiences that a lot of times you don't even notice it. A lot of time, the issue of racism only affects the victim because it's so hidden with our day-to-day experiences. But what happened is we need to talk about it. And I'm not saying, okay, you're experiencing racism, sexism, you're forced to go out and defend yourself. But you need to talk about it when you feel good and ready. You need to open the discussion. And if you feel no one's listening to you, take it higher up. Because it's something that needs to be under control. And no one needs to live in a toxic work environment. Talking about living in a toxic work environment, I just want to add 2 quick points that was covered during the longer sessions. That no one's forced to live in a toxic, work in a toxic environment. If you need, take a time off, do it. Keep an account of when is your vacation time. Keep an account of if you need to take a sick day or a mental health day. Because sometimes you're thinking mental health, you can work through it out, you're going to feel better, but you're just going to hit a burnout. You're just going to eventually reach the point that you cannot say, oh, it's going to get better. If you need to take a mental health day, do it. Also, if you feel that toxic work environment is not changing or is not willing to kind of grow as far as you're growing, you can always have the option of moving on to the next place. Always keep your options open. Remember, you're not stuck and you're not forced to live in a toxic work environment. And that's why to understand and differentiate between a toxic work environment and a work environment that can become healthier is to have a very open way of communication to avoid confusion and kind of it helps create accountability and purpose. It helps create accountability and purpose for everyone. And it's like if someone is being toxic, that person needs to be addressed. And if sometimes you just open up and start talking about it, the problem can be solved. That takes me to the next slide. If Dr. Singh can go to the next, thank you so much. So, and I know I want to apologize. I put in 7 tips on the thing, but there were 8. And as soon as I recorded, I was like, what did I do? And it was so close to the end. So just going back to these 8 tips, these 8 tips becomes very important when you want to have a very effective communication. And as you can see, there are 8 of them. I'm going to start off by talking about like kind of active listening. And active listening is very important because active listening uh, kind of allows for the communication to begin. If you're not participating and actively listening to the other person, how can you address your problem? I've seen sometimes you're having this disagreement with someone and you're going back and forth with them and you see they're just standing there and trying to get their point across. How can you get your point across when you haven't heard my point? And that leads to the next one, clarity and concession. So what you have to do is stop the person, say, you're not actively listening to me. Clearly express what you want to say. So clarity becomes very important. And I'm not just talking about the active listening, but when you have something to say, make sure you know what you want to say. Make sure you know what you want to say. Have it completely in front of you and say, okay, this is the problem and this is what I want to discuss. And when you know what you want to say, you're going to have the confidence to say it. So in part, confidence and clarity kind of goes hand in hand. When you're very certain about what you want to say and you're clear about your ideas and your opinions, you can be very confident about it. One of the problems is like a lot of times when we're dealing with conflicts, people see this situation as like a war zone. It's always good to maintain your friendliness and your empathy. Because sometimes it's just a matter of miscommunication. Maybe the person who you're having a problem with is not trying to attack you personally. It's a matter of miscommunication because of the lack of clarity that was existing before. So always maintain that friendliness and maintain that empathy and open up to the person and try to understand it from their side. And when you start a conversation friendly and you're having this open discussion, you kind of allow for the other person to share their opinions and concerns. And it leads to activism. So these eight are constantly, there is this mini tango that all of these tips are dancing with each other. So we have reached to the sixth. It's always important to maintain an open mind. Sometimes you're on the wrong. Sometimes you have to see it from the other person's perspective to understand the challenge that they're coming from. And obviously it leads to respect. And it's always beautiful to have a respectful relationship. And when you're having an effective communication, all of these come with it. When you're being respectful and understanding and keeping an open mind and being friendly and empathetic, and that respect comes from your confidence, clarity, your confidence and clarity. And lastly, it was something that is very important because so far it is from your side of the effective communication. Sometimes you need to be open to criticism. Sometimes you are, uh, maybe you are on the wrong. Maybe your view is like not being perceived as the way you're thinking is supposed to be. And be open to criticism. And those criticism doesn't mean that you have to now change your entire lifestyle to match the criticism that is bestowed upon you. It's just when you're open to the criticism and open to feedback, you kind of start seeing it from the other person's perspective. Not only that, you can kind of take the criticism and change that, or you can take the criticism and work around it. So it becomes very important to have an effective communication skill. It's so important to be very present and very at the time to discuss the problem. And one of the things that I wanted to be your takeaway is like confidence. Be confident as in what you want to say. And with confidence, all of the other gonna follow.
Wow, guys, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh and Dr. Khayambashi. That was really, really interesting. And I thank you to those that registered and attended, joined us today. And thank you for participating. I appreciate you being here. And remember to follow us on social media and our future webinars. We have food and mood coming up this May, and Shake Off the Dirt and Move Forward coming up in June. So check out their site often so that you can be updated on our upcoming programs. This was so wonderful, and I hope people had a great takeaway. I know it refreshed a lot of things for me. You know, part of it being self-care, you know, speaking your truth, you know, speaking your truth, even if it's in the work environment, and to make sure that whatever you're doing is aligned with who you are, and you know, so that you can perform. I think it's a win-win situation when you do that, because you're not self-sabotaging by maybe acting out in a certain way, and getting to do what it is that you do want to do. So I think it's very helpful. I know that I try to, in even recruiting volunteers, to say, you know, what is it that you love doing? You know, I have people that maybe work in one field, and I may want to tap into their skills in that field, but they're, no, I want to do something completely different because I want to get away from what I do during the day, you know? So I think, yeah, just finding that healthy environment and where you can speak your truth and be doing the things you want to do. So I thank you so much again for your time and for sharing this series with us. And we look forward to many more in the future.
Great.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you again.